But yeah, so today we're going to talk about mocking an API. And the very first part about this is just like, who am I and why do you care? My name is Daniel Randall. I'm a staff engineer, camera specialist, primarily for BD, which is the largest pharmaceutical company you've never heard of. They do a lot of testing and antigen stuff, big into the COVID space. They recently acquired the startup that I was with. I'm also the CEO of Digital Tectonics LLC, which is primarily focused on mobile development and like interesting client-based projects like hiring and demo presentations. I'm a disabled vet. I was in the Navy for quite a few years. Got hurt and got out. I've been a mobile developer for about 13 years, both on Android and iOS, professionally back and forth, and Android is currently my mainstay, but I do run a dual native development shop, so I do a lot of iOS code as well. I'm a newly minted dad. I have 14-month old little girl that's running around. And you can see here, these images didn't even load, which is great. I'll have to edit that later. But let's get into the meat of this. The goal that I like to start out with this way, like say, what are the goals of the talk? You know, why are we here? What are we going to learn? And so the big part about this is understanding the why, when, and how for mocking an API, right? There's going to be a lot of questions. Why would you do this? Why wouldn't you just rely on the other, like the actual API itself? So we're going to jump right in. So when and why for this particular decision is really crushed together. One doesn't exist without immediately asking the other thing. And so I kind of put up this little quote here. We can use this until prod is ready. Oftentimes, you know, if you build something that bridges a gap in your software, right? Too many of us have seen the scenario where they, you know, if it works, don't, you know, if it isn't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. But we're going to try to keep it on the KISS side of this. We're trying to say, hey, when is mocking an API the right idea? When is it not? And then some kind of reasons why you can want to do it and why you'd want to do it and when would it kind of make sense for you, the greatest thing. And so I have these little tags here. This rule number 1, do not duplicate the API work, right? If you're doing a mock and you're doing tons of business logic, calling databases, trying to figure all the right responses to send down to your client, you are building an API, you're not building a mock. So kind of keep that in mind here. The big part about this is going to be determining the scope, right? And you want to do that very early. Are you just doing the API work is kind of what's often get asked whenever you, especially if you're doing this for a client, right? You're like, no, I'm not doing the API work. I'm just building something so that we're going to unblock anything. And so I kind of have this mental checklist here that I put into actual text. It's when is this an easy choice, right? Like you're doing an MVP, there's no API currently, right? Like nothing exists. And then the UI that is blocked. And for mobile, that becomes a really big thing. You can have like network designed APIs. So let's say there's a model and there's an optional string in it, and then you don't show an entire view because of that, right? So you can get kind of blocked in these scenarios where, yeah, you can have these localized data, and then it kind of comes down to there's not the same response time, so you're not calculating for that. You're not doing all of your network stack is kind of getting behind the ball on it. And it leads for bad experiences and bad demos because you're not actually showing them what is really happening within the app. And the other side of the spectrum is hard. Like, do you use this for a new feature, or you're so new in it, there are no model designs, right? Like, there's not even a user model. You're going, okay, how am I supposed to mock something that doesn't already have some kind of idea of what it needs to be? And the general thing with like a user is, you know, you have their first name, maybe their last name as well, their username, you know, their permissions, that kind of stuff that goes along with it. And so if you don't have any kind of agreement to what you're actually modeling, mock is probably not the answer for you, right? You probably need uh, you probably jump too far ahead, and you need to go back and say, okay, hey, we need to lay out the bulk of what the purpose, the scope of the API actually does. And so that's where I have this rule number 2: define the mock scope at the start, right? If it's there, so you're creating a bridge until an API team is able to kind of give you everything, but they have a pretty good idea of what's already going to be developed. They already know that you're going to need a list of favorites. They have a list of articles, and here's all the information the article model will contain, right? These are something that you could just go, okay, hey, I can take a snapshot of this. I can put up some pseudo JSON for it, right? And then allow my client, the consumer of it, to dial up, grab that, get a, and most mocks that I do are static responses, and go, hey, okay, now I can have the API relate to it. And the big part about it is really define the scope of the mock at the start, right? The most recent big project that I did was, hey, we know the API is going to be basically not done up until the day that we could release the consumer end of it. And so we need a way, which was not great planning, but we need a way that the app can basically be said, we're good to go as soon as we can switch over to staging or switch over to production, right? And this kind of helps bridge that gap between there. Mocks shouldn't be used as another environment unless you're doing it for like new feature creation, and that's where the really nuancy of this. When do you make that decision? And so I've got a couple more scenarios that I'll walk through to hopefully give you guys some insight in how I make those choices, and then how you can make those choices or help provide the information to a client even to help them make that determination, because you're in the end you're spending their money, right? So it kind of comes down to the how, right? And my keys for success on this particularly comes out to be all of my successful attempts have kind of followed these 3 exact same rules. And I'm a military vet, so checklists are huge from where I come from, so you can kind of see a rolling theme here. Pick a system / language that you're very, very familiar with, right? Like my back end stuff is all PHP. I do some Laravel. I do a lot of Node.js for bots, but not back end stuff with it. I do a lot of Java and Kotlin development for mobile development, but I don't really use them as back end. So for my latest series of mocks, they're all in PHP, right? Because I'm familiar with that. I'm able to quickly diagnose what's wrong and turn it around. The idea is you're developing a very small product that is not designed to scale at all, right? And that's where number 2 comes in. Understand the connections will be very limited, right? You're not building something that needs to go from 1 or 2 developers hitting it at the same time to 10,000 end users hitting it at the same time, right? You don't need scalability. You need something, whatever you choose, just needs to be able to deliver to you or your team in an effective manner. And so the third one that I like to say is set up a smoke test to fail very fast, right? Like as soon as you deploy it, start beating on it. And if it breaks, figure out, okay, is it such a breaking thing that we need to go in and add more development to it? Or is it something that we're actually experiencing on the consumer side? And so rule 3 kind of gets wrapped up. If the mock is not saving time, stop, right? It's not supposed to add extra overhead. You're like, oh, we got to make it compatible with the mock now. We need to have this whole transition where we can, it's such a big stretch to get off the mock to actually go to staging. Those should all be warning signs of the project. Like the mock is more of a litmus test for what you're doing. And so now I'm actually going to kind of get into how I start designing the mock real quick. And this kind of boils down to the basics, right? You need an HTML code, which means like 200 or 201 for success if you're using authentication. You need a content type in that payload, application JSON, most people anyway, and then a message body, right? What is actually in there? Is it an error? Is it the full JSON payload? What's going on? And so I have a pretty standardized template that just, in-house tools. You've done this enough times, you auto-generate it, but I kind of laid out my design here. And it's you have a mock API URL, So you like for us, it's like digitaltectonics.com / whatever the project name is, and then you dial into an API PHP point, right? And then as long as you know the schema from then on, right, you're good. So one particular one to note though is authentication, and this usually trips a lot of people up because uh, you're doing like secure connections and you want to make sure that that's valid. Tokens, especially for mobile apps, is like a very huge sticking point of how you log someone in. Those often break whole teams if they're not ready for that kind of stuff. So I added in the graphic to kind of show is when you call into like our API system, you go call into authentication. It does all the token generation, sends that down, and then calls back over to the user controller and gets the user as well and hands that back. Which most of the systems that I work with are kind of designed along that same paradigm, because you've got the token and you send it down, and now you've become a tokenized endpoint. You then go grab the user because that's just the flow of it, right? And so your end client has the token and then automatically right after gets the user as well. So you're all logged in a very seamless thing with a low response time. And then you can see some of the other endpoints are like search. So you can pass up a query if you're not doing it locally. You can get your article list. And it just scales pretty easily from there. And you guys can stop me at any time if you have questions. I'm going a little bit faster than I normally would because I had a whole bunch of nice transitions. They're just not here right now. This is kind of our boilerplate snapshot of one of our controllers. So we do a quick check, just any outside bot stuff to make sure that the request method type is what you want it to be. That way you could fail very quickly. You should get an error message right off the bat that says, hey, this method is not supported, right? And that's what I meant by set up your smoke checks so that you can actually figure out, is your mock broken, or is the data that you're being handed down broken? And so here you can kind of see right off the bat, we check the request type. We then say, okay, hey, just generate some response data in a very, I'm kind of covering it. Let me move this over for you guys. Yeah. So you can see that this is just a first name, last name, really easy JSON. It's encapsulated in a string here. And then if for some reason, like if you had other variables that you wanted to take in from, like say get like a value or a username, so you can, kind of add a little customization, we have this extra catch here. It says, oh, something went wrong, gives you the error message, says 500 internal server. So it's simulating all the scenarios that you can get involved with errors. So if you wanted to do the mock for errors, right, without actually having to generate error logs on your staging and definitely not on your production level, you're able to kind of simulate that as well. And that's why this is our kind of our very boilerplate template piece. The nice thing as well, like 422, unable to process entry on this, right? It says, hey, were you trying to do a post, but this endpoint is a get? Or my biggest one I use this for is patches, right? Patch for mobile is used very infrequently. So I like to kind of have that developer catch. So it comes down in their logs and says, hey, you're trying to do a post here. This is actually a patch. You need to update for that. And then the very bottom is just the standard kind of way of sending it out. You put the type, like I said in the previous slide, put it in the application JSON, and you give the error, or you give the HTML status code for it, right? In this case, a 200. For like login, we do 201, so there's a bit of differential between it, and it's easier to catch in a list of a lot of calls, especially if you're making concurrent calls. Like when in the mobile world, sometimes you can do shotguns at the beginning of an application. You can make 3, 4, 5 network calls, and they're all kind of asynchronous. You don't want them to come back in the order. But if one of them is to auto log someone in, we use 201s as a kind of a way to say, hey, look, this is a unique thing, and it separates itself from, other calls. I kind of showcased this talk a little bit to another developer, and they wanted to bring up something pretty diverse here. And this is like localhost versus hosted. On the mobile side of it, we do a lot of hosted stuff because there can be a lot of tricky components to doing localhost to a network call. You get a lot of, hey, this isn't secure. Especially you have to have SSL certificates unless you have very specific knowledge on how to disable those, right? So I figured this was a great slide to show what's the difference between the local host and a hosted thing. Um, uh, Obviously, I like some of the JSON stuff with Node.js where you can just spin up a whole server really quickly, but and it comes with low cost and it's very quick to update. The big problem is, like, if you're a solo developer working on something, or if this is a hobby project for you, that's great, right? Low cost to maintain your hobby, keeps money in pocket for other things. But I've found some issues when I want to do like SSL and I don't want to just have a certificate just for kind of this testing thing, or if you one that's dedicated specifically to my hobby. And again, like I said, it can be a struggle on mobile, particularly if you're only focusing on like newer operating systems, because they get very picky about that kind of stuff. And Blue Ocean, I think, is like $5 a month. You can have a virtual computer pretty quickly, pretty easily. I think our GoDaddy one that we use is like $3.50 a month. We buy them in 3-year packs. So a hosted thing for us is very easy for mobile. It works right off the bat. Plus, we have a very large team. Sometimes, like 10 developers can be interacting with it any one time, and we can make sure everyone's on the same version, right? And that's something I didn't cover, versioning. If you're doing multiple versions of a mock, you're probably doing API work, right? Like, that's another call out. Con can be the cost, right? Like, if you're just doing this as a side project or something, do you really want to pay, $100 for 3 years of GoDaddy on this? Maybe not, right? And again, you can also have SSL certificate issues, right? I mean, those can just plague everyone. I called these bonuses. I think my wife said maybe these are just like extra tips. Don't include sensitive information, aka use dummy data, right? Like, if you're going to put stuff on there, don't include someone's social security stuff. Don't include real names, or people that are directly connected to the project. Judge your risk about what's exposed and what's not, right? Cybersecurity should be something that's in the forefront of most people's minds on these things when they're designing APIs, because there are roaming bots that just kind of look for APIs to exploit and so forth. So don't put sensitive information in your mock, please. One cool step that some of our mocks do is you can actually have the API call the real API. So we've got a couple systems in-house that you can take a snapshot of a data model that you want, like the contract, and put it in there, and then it'll check for all of the non-optionals, right? It'll say, okay, hey, I'm looking for a string here at first name. And if it's not there, it'll actually then say, okay, hey, the staging API is not ready. It fails over and sends a static payload. Now, this is starting to get into that bridge territory where you're just like, hey, is this becoming a mock or is this becoming a proxy, right? Are you doing this for transformation where you're changing data and sending it down? And that's kind of where we draw the line. It's mostly, we only do this on very specific cases where we know that the API is in constant flux, because it's under current heavy development. And so we want to make sure that, like, when we hand a demo build out, we'd much rather it call to the mock API and say, okay, best case, they'll get real staging data, right? Or worst case, it will not crash. And that's kind of where we value our presentation and the time that goes into creating the mocks, right? But a simple C curl can do quite a bit. And there's plenty of guides out there. Like I said before, double check that you're not mocking a post as a Git. We had one scenario where that was going on. I also use patch in there. I like to throw that out. And the biggest part about this is where a lot of frameworks and people on the social media, Twitterverse, beat you up for, oh, you're duplicating your code here, why you're copy pasting everything is a common meme. Duplicated code in your mock is okay. This isn't your main project. Like us, we have a template, and you can look at the controllers, and they're virtually all identical, right? Some of them, are, you go back in, you tweak a few things, you add the ability to take in a variable and do a little bit of logic so that maybe the API feels a bit more responsive to what you're trying to do, or you're setting up for error states, right? But don't get bogged down into kind of like the tech bro crunch on this thing and say, hey, your code always has to be super functional. Anytime you're repeating it 3 times, you automatically should be refactoring something. Don't worry about those scenarios in this. This is definitely more of a thing you're putting up there to unblock yourself. And it goes back to kind of rule number 3. Like, if the mock is not saving you time, don't do it, right? Just put a stop to it and move on. So this is kind of my summary of it. Define the mock's purpose at the start, right? Like, what do you want to achieve with it? Is this a bridge until your team is able to catch up? Is this kind of allowing you to showcase a new feature? What is it really there for? And when is it going to go end of life, right? So that you can be deleted. Do not duplicate the API work, right? I'd actually have these. Do not duplicate the API's work, right? Like, if you're doing complex business logic or fetching from a real database, guess what? You're not mocking anymore. And again, number 3, I can't harp on this anymore. Like, if your mock is not saving you time, just stop, right? There's some really cool tools. I got introduced to one yesterday by James. It's great. I've already started playing with it a bit, and I can share a link, or he can. It uses JavaScript. I'm not huge into JavaScript on the API side of things, but it was fun to play with. So make sure, if you're doing it as a hobby thing, right, figure out the amount of time you're putting into to each component of this, because maybe you just need it as a real API, and then you might want to look for technology that can actually scale up. Okay, I went through that fairly quickly. Anyone have any questions? I mean, yeah. Unfortunately, I'd love to give hard and fast rules on when to proxy and when not to, uh, because that adds a significant layer of overhead, right? Like, we've actually created a whole internal project over that to just simplify it. And I have been playing with this MSW quite a bit. I do like that it does GraphQL things. That's something that ours won't do, right? So there are definitely really good technologies out there, and like, dive into some of them and play with it, right? I like to set aside time to experiment with new tech, but I think, to answer your question, when to do a proxy and when to not, is basically, are you getting to the point where you're close enough that you think you can hard switch from the mock over to your staging or prod environment, and maybe set up 1 or 2 endpoints as a way to kind of gauge that, right? Like, okay, hey, my first call will definitely go call this, and if it is just standard valid, like like what I call a curl, right, then just pass it down. Don't even check it, right? Just check that it is not empty, and then hand it down, and then start testing to see if your consumer is working with it. And if it is, right, that's great. Now you can start either pushing that out to the rest, or maybe you actually want to go in and switch your base URL out back to staging and start, and not have to basically become a full proxy. Does that answer your question, James? Yeah, there are. So the talk actually led to a ton of extra research, and it kind of slowed down what I originally had thought. I was just going to jump in here and be like, hey guys, this is, my lessons, here's my bruises. And there are some really good tools out there to help you kind of quickly generate one of these. But I mean, I haven't done the Swagger thing. We are looking to have like a system where you can kind of grab a Swagger doc, put it in there, and it'll auto generate it. This MSW thing is really good because you basically open a real small little server, you put the endpoint in, you're like, here's what the response is, and you're done. And what I like to do with the Swagger docs is because it kind of gives you an example, you can just copy those and then fill in the data and then put them in a string, right? And you're done. I haven't used Stoplight though, so I'm not as familiar with it. And again, guys, some of this is going to be limited. My technology stuff is mostly focused on mobile, so that's where a lot of it is, but I kind of understand what's going on the web side. How far, okay, so we have another question. How far do you need to go for the mock? I.e., do you just need to, one second, just need to have JSON data to the consumer? Do you need to follow best practices? Okay, I am not familiar. What is HATEOAS? I might have to Google that one, guys. But best practices, right? Like I said, keep it very simple. If you can get it up and running in 20 minutes, or you can get it scalable in 3 hours, are you going to be able to recover that differential of like 2.5+ hours, right? If you're not, get it so it just works, right? Because the goal of the mock is to save you time or to unblock you, right? We had a couple of clients that had very specific stuff where there was a lot of nullability in their contract, and they wanted certain UI to not show up if those fields weren't provided, like that data wasn't provided. So it's very hard to mock that in a static sense, right? And so we would just have it where you could pass up a value that says, hey, full null on, full new null true, and so it would say, okay, if this boolean is true, give it all back as basically null as possible, and then to see what that kind of package goes. You can break a lot of rules making your mock, because in the end, your mock is there to satisfy and allow you to jump over hurdles versus actually be something that you hand off to production. And that's why I really push guys, like, set the scope of what you're trying to do. Define the purpose for this. Does that answer your question? Okay. And I mean, I'm going to put up some of this code on our website. I'll give a link. I still need a bit of time to clean it up. I was using Carbon to try to make good snapshots, but they have a bug in their code where the last curly bracket is then rolled up into the images, and it doesn't look right. As soon as someone sees the code, you're like, wow, something's wrong with it. Where's the missing end bracket of all these snapshots? So I will put some code up for PHP, right? And no, guys, you can, like I said, do this in the language you're most familiar with. We had one guy that was super into Golang, and you just kind of go, okay, go ahead and go, man. Do your go for business. And I mean, it worked. It was awesome. He spent like 4 or 5 hours and got a very replicatable thing. We may end up switching over to it in future projects, but that is more of the outlier versus the norm for what you should be looking at. Yeah, we even had one person talk about using GitHub as a way to like control the traffic out, and like because GitHub has pages, so you could manipulate the static response from it. I don't think, I haven't seen the whole project of it, but yeah, the main thing is really that, hey, if you have a really good idea, you want to see what its limits are, but you don't want to have to build a database. You don't have to get involved in all of this, especially with the stack, the group being full stack, right? Like, how much work it can be to set up a real database, right? Like a relational or even a Firebase, kind of like horizontal scaled, page system. So balance out what you're doing, right? Like, some systems are going to be much harder to mock out. Others are just there so you can get something off the ground. But yeah, Next.js probably would be a fantastic way to get it just up and running and hand it out. I think Sean has an incoming question, so excited. And a lot of this, guys, comes out to be that I think I've done mocks maybe 2 or 3 dozen times over projects, and some of them were just to fill gaps or give clients kind of a demo thing, and then they ended up either handing it off to their API team and said, okay, hey, go agree on the contract for this. Sometimes they're icebreakers. You need to get a project started. You need to get it off the ground. For us in the mobile world, that little spinner, hey, we're actually making a call that takes more than a half a second, right, for a long list of items to come back. Okay, so the question is, if you're starting from scratch and mocking up an MVP, do you need to connect everything, i.e. set up an API gateway to direct your API calls, or should you just connect directly? So this comes out to be like, you can actually see on this chart right here, our endpoint directly calls this API.php instead of like having it as API/v1. And it's mostly because I'm not that great at HTTP access file generations and parsing. And I think there's another file in there you have to set up, right, to just hack that off. So we just get it up and running, right? The idea is, and follow the original principles, like, don't put sensitive information in it. Like, if it's publicly exposed, it's publicly exposed. So getting it off the ground is often just better than saying, okay, I have to follow all of the best practices in the industry, or even these 5 best practices. Really, if it meets your goal, I really wish I had a picture of the footbridge I had, which like showed, hey, here's the Golden Gate Bridge. It needed to be this way because it had to span such a large thing. But if your water obstacle that you're transversing is only a small trickle and you can get away with like a standard 2x4 that you can tight walk across, well, there's significant hundreds of millions of dollars difference in what your outlay has to be to achieve the same end goal, right? And that's why I really talk about these rules for me, and really boils down to define the purpose, right? Figure out what you're really wanting to achieve with it, and then make sure you're not duplicating the work of what your real API would do. Now, if you're using it as like a prototype or an API that scales up, understand that whatever you're writing needs to be in your mind as thrown away, right? Like, it's just going to be gone, or it's going to be reused for the next mock you do, but it's not going to be a thing that you want to take and then scale up. That kind of defeats the whole purpose. Then you're acting either more as like a transformative, or you're acting more as a pre-proxy for your own API. The goal really needs to be here that you put it up. It's like an old West town, right? Like a gold rush town. It comes together, the saloon comes up, the other buildings kind of come up, and then as soon as the gold is out, leave. Yeah, and I mean, I'll provide my email address and so forth. So if you guys want to just chat, about other, professionals, like, what do you want to do, if you're in this situation. When in doubt, a lot of us have, even junior developers, right? Sometimes you got to go with your gut, and what does your gut tell you to do on this? Mocks kind of are the other way, right? Because you're so trained, best practices, scalability, the whole idea that a developer behind you is going to come pick it up. That you kind of just throw all out the window for mock. It's there to get scaffolding, so you can hold up that Hollywood facade of a building, right, long enough to get the client to understand what their goals are, right, or to prevent the app from crashing. But as soon as you go to production with it and you're still using your mock, you have overbuilt. it should never survive that amount of traffic. I mean, we have a cap on ours of something like 125 connections, which is huge. It should way bigger than it ever needs to be. And so if you're at a point at work and you're like, hey, if I'm building a new feature or an MVP, right, and starting completely from scratch, you have no models, you may want to just invest in time to get with the UI UX people. Okay, what is this going to look like? Okay, we've identified a few views that are very, you know, easy to identify, like a user profile or maybe just the header. What is the header going to look like? Does it have any dynamic data in it? And if it does, okay, start putting some ideas of what that model looks like and talk to the API team and say, hey, this is the contract we're going to start with. And then just mock that out. And if they come back and go, oh man, there's no way we'd have to call these two databases and do joins and transforms and all this stuff, we'll have to break it up, right? Well, at least you gave them somewhere to tell you no from or a starting point. I guess my biggest thing here, I've done startups. I've gone all the way up to like Lowe's, which is a Fortune 40 company, and ran 30 something Android developers, and figure out the things that are really stopping you from making progress and build something to like get over that hurdle, dig under it, right? Cross that bridge, whatever it takes to do it. And because that's what really sets the engineers that have that like drive, is to say, okay, cool, yeah, business has said X, but if we spend an hour planning and an hour developing this mock, or 3 hours, that's only half a day, and we'll unblock all this other stuff to go in parallel. Think how many development hours you're saving, right? And I know that's maybe a little bit more businessy oriented, and as I'm now running my own successful like development shop, that's things clients want to know. They would rather sit down with you for 30 minutes and hear your opinions on how do you structure something in a slightly different way or a more uniformed way, so that they're not paying for like triple development. And or maybe you're on the other flip side of it. I like to develop because I enjoy coding, and so I only like taking projects that I want to code. So making 5 different versions of the same model that are slightly different and having to write unit tests for all of them, that's more hair pulling out for me than I want. And I have like a 1-year-old little daughter that I would rather have her parent pull my hair out than doing that. And so sometimes making suggestions to an end client and saying, hey, we see this common UI is used everywhere, let's make it a component and standardize it, can be applied to your mock as well. Because you may see something in it while you're mocking out and going, hey guys, we're using a model that's really similar in 2 or 3 big places. Can we just like either nest this thing or streamline it into one model? And then your mock has just actually done more research for you. Now that's an edge case, of course, but it can help you look at things from different perspectives. I hope I've given you guys some good insight here. I'm kind of shotgunning around it to make sure I cover as much of the base, because it is a full stack group. There's probably people front end, oh yeah, man, I can never get certain things to load on time. And how do you balance that? I mean, if you guys also have questions on, what would you have liked to have seen this talk to further expand, don't hesitate to ask that either. I want to make sure that this thing was worth your time and that uh, it made you think about this as an option. You may never do a mock, right? But at least have started the conversation for it, see it as a possible tool, right? Not every tool in your tool chest has to get used every single day. And that's kind of the big point about this particular talk, right? Like mocking an API isn't always the first step on something. And more often than not, it's probably one of the last options for what you're wanting to do. So I just want to make sure, guys, like keep all your tools dusted off in your tool chest. There's a question, what steps do I use to build out an API? So I start off with there's usually a design doc, right? Or hopefully that gives you kind of a whole bunch of models or the ability to copy JSON models from. And like what I showed, we kind of just have this template piece. And in the actual API.php controller, it does a parsing on a URL. That's the secret sauce behind it. It takes a URL, it parses it out and says, okay, it takes all the units and then goes and generates, finds the class with that name. So if it's like articles search by author, then it'll have like that kind of name controller, and it'll have this code basically wrapped inside of a class for it. If you're not familiar with PHP, you can also do it with JavaScript, where you kind of just call that function by name, and then we just upload it, and that's kind of the big tricky point for it. I mean, once you've done it once or twice, get all your notes, because there'll be lots of lessons learned by the first time you do it. I mean, mocking out your first API probably will give you more sympathy to any of your API teams, because you're going, oh, I'm only doing the very front end of this part, and I'm just giving a string back. Sean's question is, I guess my question was, at a higher level, do you start with the wireframes and have the front end and back end developers build out a contract based on the wireframes? I look at the screens and determine what data needs to be live there and build out the APIs based on that. Okay, yeah, no, I guess I was getting too technical in it. So yeah, no, this is great. If it was more of a discussion thing, you could have been like, oh, wait a minute, hold on. But yeah, I'm definitely subscribed to the old adage, 5 minutes of planning saves at least an hour development time. So if you have wireframes, that's great, right? If you have more of what I call like the blocks, you have pages where you know these screens are going to come up, and you're like, okay, what is common to all of it? Okay, is there a login? Well, you probably need to build your user thing first, right? And if you're going to mock that out first. If you already have like a full Figma with all the wireframes, go in there and there isn't a contract already, right? Like a design doc, go in there and look at it and be like, okay, ideally, if I was developing this, what would I want on every screen? And for mobile people, right, and I can speak very clear on this, we want to make only one API call per page if possible, right? So, but that's not always achievable. So sometimes you have to go, okay, how do I break this out? Is this something I hold in cache? Right? And it's going, okay, well, if we have a logged in user, we need to maintain that in a cache state the whole time, right? So on this page, I want only this article that I'm going after. Okay, well, what is in this article? Does it have a hero image to it, right? It has an author, a date, is there a link to another thing, right? And kind of ask all the questions behind that in a perfect scenario. And then you can put your mock as the perfect scenario if you really wanted to. And then come back and go, okay, ooh, we heard from the API team we can't do X and Y. Okay, we'll start shaving some of it down. I've ran into more cases where showing the API team the mock like response has got, oh, we can do this. So I don't know. Sometimes there's a bit of an arms race there. But I think the highest takeaway from this, Sean, is that look at where you are. If you have wireframes, that's great. Plan your best case scenario. If you don't have wireframes, but you have like sketches of what screens are, take it from a holistic point of view, especially if you've ever built something before. Use the lessons learned from previous projects and apply them directly to the project. That was kind of my biggest thing. That's why I loved being from one startup to another startup to another startup to getting acquired, because you get to learn, you get to fail a lot and you learn from those mistakes. And as long as you're not repeating the same mistakes, right, or at least advising people about those mistakes, you're educating everyone, and everyone gets to share a little bit of that pain, but also that knowledge that you've gained from it. And so, you know, in this kind of tech crunchy world we currently are in, where companies are like, well, we don't want to spend a ton of money or to have a UX UI person on hand, we're going to send it out to a designer. Sometimes you can help craft those designs if you already have a good idea of what the end goal for it is going to be. Like if you already know what you want to show on different screens, you can make those mocks happen and then transition those over to more and more refined designs. But if you already have a whole bunch of designs, look for commonality between them, right? See if there's things that you can go just from not stylized views, right, but to reusable full-blown components. And if that's there, how do those map to the model object you're already working with, right? You're like, okay, this has to be populated by this set of information. And if that keeps linking on, you'll be able to say, okay, hey, I just need this object embedded, right? It needs to be nested for all of these sequential calls. It also depends on how friendly you want to be with the API building team. I got that's the other flip side of it, right? Because there's always competition. I like to try to provide as much feedback as possible to the API people because they're probably just working just as hard as I am to deliver the front end of this thing. Sean says, I'm in charge of them, so I'm very happy. Yeah. And I mean, let's say you are the head of the API team, right? And that actually changes the frame of this kind of discussion. Say you're the head of the API team, and you're like, when do you want to build a mock, right? That dynamic kind of changes because you're saying, hey, if we build a mock, do we make sure that our consumer understands that this is a temporary design, right? These aren't permanent contracts. So make sure there's lots of communication if you're doing that. It's easier when you have smaller teams and you're like, okay, we're going to build this. There's clearly a story up in Jira or ClickUp that says, hey, we're going to build out this mock, and people can provide feedback there. They're like, oh man, hey, we really want X in the model, right? And that can actually help you shape the final product for you, right? Because maybe you have a V0 of it as your mock, and then you go, okay, guys, now we're going to go really do this. We're going to use Ruby or we're going to use Next or whatever the real application technology stack that you're going to use that is more scalable. And you're like, okay, the V0 is our mock, right? And that actually makes your API endpoint or base URL kind of change easier. And you're actually using version, which almost inherently puts you in the best practice box already, right? So you're able to say, okay, consumer, now go to V1, right? And see what happens there. So there's lots of ways to frame it, but the big part being that a mock is more static than it is not, like than it's dynamic. Okay, James, should I give one more round of questions? I want to be considerate of everyone's time here. Yeah, I usually do Twitch stream stuff, so there's more like movie components. But technology is only convenient when it actually works. But no, this has been fun, and I may, I'll take as much feedback as I can from this, and who knows, might sign up for one later this year or early next year again. Yeah, and just for the people listening, right? Like, you don't always have to have an instructional guide how to do it, right? Sometimes, and this is based on large companies and even in the military, having a reflection of what went wrong can actually be more like a greater learning moment than saying, "Oh, I'm an expert. I have done all of these things." Right? This is how you must do it. This is the best practice. This is the gold standard. Uh, Too many times, uh, I'll work with a team as a team lead and be like, guys, I have done almost everything you can do wrong. I have mapped those out. Now, I'm not saying what I'm going to say is always right, because we can add to that map of wrong, but let's learn from the pain that I've already endured, right? And so if there are people out there that are thinking that, oh, I don't have anything to share, share an experience, right? We've always heard the horror stories of a junior developer or sometimes a senior developer, right? Deleting an entire production database, right? How did you get to that point is a very interesting story that can also give lots of lessons learned. So I encourage everyone to think, you all have experiences in development, even if you're new or seasoned, right? That you can share to the group and maybe even find some commonality in there, or just share how your experience shaped or prevented that problem from happening in the future, right? Because people will take that away. Sometimes whole billion-dollar ideas come away from that. So I just want to make sure that other developers are encouraged to step forward and talk through these things. But I appreciate all of your time, and hopefully I'll see you guys around.